All right, welcome back for what will be this final video for the learning chapter. And so let's discuss other forms of learning. So of course, there's not just the learning of associations, but we can learn it through a variety of other ways as well. And so for instance, there's something known as observational learning. So this is learning without direct experience by watching and imitating others. And so we do this a lot. So for instance, learning to tie your shoes. You learn to do that by imitating an adult, right? So an adult taught you how to tie your shoes, you followed suit, right? Learning language, right? It's likely that your parent or caretaker made sounds towards you, right? You reciprocated those sounds back, and you learned through imitation again. Related to observational learning, there is this term known as modeling. So this is just basically the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. And so this is kind of like how we specifically engage in observational learning, right? So a child in this case would be modeling after their parent if they were teaching them how to tie their shoes. Okay. So a classic study of observational learning and modeling was done by a guy named Albert Bandura. And so he performed a very famous study known as the Bobo doll experiment. I'll show you a video of this experiment here on the next slide. But basically what was found in this particular study was that a child would mirror the behavior of an adult model very, very closely. And sometimes that could be a very bad thing. So for instance, observing violent behaviors might make a child more likely to engage in violent behaviors themselves. So in terms of observational learning, we are very attuned to the reinforcers and punishments that are being given. And so we live this vicariously by watching models and the consequences of their actions. And so if a model is praised for some particular reason, we would be more likely to engage in that behavior ourselves. Whereas if they were punished, then we are less likely to do that, right? So again, living vicariously through other individuals, this is kind of really the basis of observational learning. So here is the Bobo doll experiment. And so I think it's described, and they show original footage from this classic experiment.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down, and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials.
So in that original study, there was a controlled condition in which children did not see that aggressive, violent behavior. And so unsurprisingly, those children were less likely to pummel the Bobo doll. And so again, we see the role of modeling and how it can influence our behavior. We pay attention to those vicarious reinforcers and punishers. But again, we don't have to just necessarily directly experience something for us to learn about something, right? So next, let's talk about mirror neurons in relation to observational learning. So there are particular neurons, and they were found originally in macaque monkeys in the 1990s by an Italian research group. And they called these neurons mirror neurons, okay? And these neurons are super interesting in how they work. It was later discovered that they're found in humans as well, so in the prefrontal cortex. And these neurons are active not only whenever the individual, originally it was a monkey, but whenever people too, are performing actions, but also whenever they are observing other actions as well. And so it's the same neurons that are active in both scenarios. And this might provide the neural basis for everyday imitation and observational learning. And so here we see kind of a brain map showing areas in which we see kind of increased activity, and these mirror neurons are found in these particular areas. So over here on the left, this is whenever a person is performing a particular activity. Over here on the right is whenever they're observing that same activity, and you'll notice there are some overlap in terms of the areas of activation. So this is really interesting. So some people even argue that mirror neurons are the basis of human empathy, and they allow us to perspective take. They're related to theory of mind, which we talked about before. And so people put a lot of importance and great weight on these mirror neurons, but nevertheless, they seem to be related to observational learning. So next, let's talk about factors influencing learning. So we're going to be kind of bouncing around here for this final video. We understand that there are different factors influencing learning, such as motivation, of course. So there's kind of like this optimal level of motivation that a person can experience that would be beneficial for learning. Organization and planning skills. So for instance, it's a lot easier to learn and retain information if you have organized notes and things like that. But also organization could refer to kind of like your own like mental hierarchy for that particular domain. So for instance, it's a lot easier for me to learn about a new baseball player because I have a very rich knowledge of baseball already. And so I can kind of, it's more easy to incorporate into that kind of elaborate mental structure that I have. Complex cognitive abilities. So for instance, like intelligence, just natural existing abilities can influence learning. Anxiety, if you are too anxious, or on the other hand, if you are not anxious enough, there's kind of like this optimal level of arousal that can influence learning. And then finally, expertise. I kind of alluded to that earlier, but basically how much knowledge you have of a particular area can influence future learning. Okay. So next we're going to talk about kind of the opposite of learning, which is forgetting. We oftentimes think of forgetting as a bad thing, but importantly, forgetting can be a very good thing. So for one, it allows us to get rid of the clutter of the mind. We don't want to remember everything, right? That wouldn't be efficient. And humans, real basically, the way that we work was that we were just efficient machines. The downside to this, of course, is that sometimes we forget important things too, right? But that kind of comes with the territory. And some argue that maybe forgetting may be a prerequisite for more learning. And so out with the old, in with the new, right? So next I want to talk about some effects in relation to learning. The first of which is known as the testing effect. This is the reason why I give so many quizzes in my class. So I give quizzes over every chapter. So the research shows that information is more easily learned if you are tested over it rather than if you repeatedly recite that information. So for instance, if you were to just reread a chapter over and over and over again. So here's a study done by Roediger and Karpicki in 2006. They're over at WashU. And so there were two conditions in this particular study. So there was a condition in which participants studied something, and then they were to take more time and study that information again. Or they studied something, and then they took a practice test over that information. And we see facts recalled here, pretty similar whenever the test took place 5 minutes after. So in this took practice test, the participant maybe read a chapter, they then took a test over that, and then they were assessed again after 5 minutes. Look what happens after 2 days though. We see this reversal. So those who actually tested themselves on their knowledge perform better on the actual test. And we see that that remains 1 week after. So essentially what that means for your own knowledge is that it is better to test yourself, to make flashcards, do things like that if you're studying for a test, rather than to reread a chapter, because that is passive, whereas testing yourself, that is active, and it allows you to identify holes in your knowledge base. Another related effect, the spaced practice effect. So spacing periods of learning across time improves learning. So spaced practice, it's best to study for instance, a test if you study 30 minutes every night, as opposed to engaging what's known as massed practice. So for instance, pulling an all-nighter. Not good for learning at all. Okay. You can use something known as elaborative encoding strategies. You can also use things known as mnemonic devices, which we'll talk about next chapter. So for instance, in this particular study, participants were studying word pairs, and they were to, in this particular condition, put it in the context of survival. So how helpful would that particular item be to help them survive? They also rated things in terms of pleasantness, imagery, so they imagined the words that they saw, self-reference, so is that personally relevant to the person? Generation, I'm trying to remember what that is, I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And intentional, I'm forgetting these two conditions right here, but nevertheless, kind of actively working with the information as opposed to just passively absorbing the words seem to be better for learning as well. And then finally, our last slide here. This is kind of just a mishmash of just these different concepts here in relation to learning and pop culture. So for one, accelerating learning programs, of which there are many, don't seem to be very effective in aiding learning. Tailoring teaching to students' learning styles does not result in improved learning. The idea or concept of learning styles, that is just a myth. There is no such thing. And then finally, your book discusses these baby Einstein videos. They do not improve learning above that of just regular parental communication. And children who watch these videos, again, are no better off than, say, children who don't. So they don't seem to be very effective, and they don't seem to be very cost effective. So that's all we have for the learning chapter. So we'll move on to the memory chapter here next.